There are quite a few types of systems that can be considered as industrial control systems, but in the context of cybersecurity, we tend to use the term SCADA. It has become almost synonymous to industrial control systems, although it is only one of them. SCADA is a supervisory control and data acquisition system. First computer-based SCADA were in the 1960s. And they tend to include some kind of interface between the human and the machine, so an HMI, a human-machine interface. They have some kind of mechanism for displaying trends in data collected, and they will have alarms set against some rules. So, for example, they might have a rule: if the water level drops below something, below a threshold, then sound an alarm or show a notification to the user. And they tend to have two-way communication with RTUs, with remote telemetry units, or with PLCs, programmable logic controllers. The image here shows a SCADA system for a pump station, and the other one is an actual image from the SCADA used, from the HMI of the SCADA used in Natanz in Iran when it was attacked by Stuxnet. The different types of SCADA systems have evolved over the years, naturally. At the very beginning, the first ones were what we now call the first generation of monolithic SCADA systems. And these monolithic SCADA systems, they would have a primary SCADA server, perhaps a standby server to kick in if the first one failed. And these SCADA servers, or this SCADA server, would be linked directly with the RTUs. The RTUs, of course, would be linked to the sensors and actuators, to the field devices. The second generation became a bit more distributed, so we don't anymore have a single server and its standby, but we have a number of different servers, each one having a different function. So there will be a whole network, the control network, to which you would have connected a server for configuring it, the SCADA system, a server having the applications running on the SCADA system, a database, a historian. The historian is where the data are collected for analysis. So this is where they are stored in order to check for trends, for example. And the same network would have the engineering the workstations for the engineers, the HMI, the human-machine interface, a server for the acquisition of the data from the field devices, and some form of communication between the data acquisition and the RTUs. So that it would not be necessarily a direct link, it might be some form of network. So this is the second generation, the distributed SCADA generation, and moving on to the current one, which is the third generation. This is where it is the networks that play most of the role. So the control network is connected to the corporate network, and it is done so usually through synchronization between the primary historian and the secondary historian. So the historian on the control network will be synchronizing with an equivalent server on the corporate network. So the two in this way are synchronized. And the control network will continue having the various servers, configuration server, application server, and so on. While on the corporate network, there will be the normal servers expected in any organization. So the server for the web, the server for the emails of the employees, the computers, and so on. The whole system is connected to the internet through typically through the corporate network. So the corporate network is what is connected to the internet, so that the people will be able to send emails, check websites, and so on, and their website and the website of the organization can be seen by others. But there will also be some external partners, so external communications that are linked either only to the corporate network or both to the corporate network and the control network. Now, this is important from the security perspective. It's a kind of a significant aspect that the control network and the corporate network might have a nice set of security measures in order to prevent any kind of infection of malware, for example. But on top of it, there will be opportunities for attackers to exploit these new connections, these external connections, which, for example, might be there so that contractors can connect for limited periods of time, for example, to the control network. It might be for the remote access of the employees for convenience, so that they can work when they are not there. But these can be exploited. And then there is, of course, the fourth generation, which is more of a vision, where the Internet of Things is what is the paradigm, is the new innovation, is what makes it a new generation. The way this works is not completely clear yet, so there is no standard kind of approach. The third generation is almost like a standard approach, so the diagram that you see there is pretty standard. The fourth generation, there is no such standard yet, but the logic is that it takes the concept of networking and machine-to-machine interaction perhaps to the extreme. So focusing on the third generation, as I said, the key point is that there is a corporate network and a control network, and the two are connected. So, for example, someone on the corporate network might be able to request data from the control network so as to complete some kind of report. In terms of the actual technologies used in industrial control networks, one of the first ones, a very old one, so although not quite obsolete yet, I mean it's still used, is Modbus. Modbus is extremely simple. Its logic is simplicity, because simplicity provides performance, and simplicity also provides reliability to some extent. So Modbus is a master-slave protocol. That means that there is a master and there are slaves. In fact, in Modbus there can be only one master, and that one master tends to be, for example, a SCADA server. And the slaves might be the RTUs, the different remote telemetry units. And the slaves, they cannot send anything. They cannot send anything on their own unless they are requested to do so by the master. So that's the logic of this kind of master-slave protocol, that the SCADA server might be asking for information from the various slaves, from the various RTUs. An example would be, please let me know about the current level of the water. Let me know about the current temperature. Then the slaves, when the slaves receive such a request from the master, then they are allowed to send a message. So they cannot send an unsolicited message. A key weakness, in fact, of Modbus is that it does not have timestamps. If there are no timestamps in the messages from the master to the slave and from the slave to the master, then it is difficult to do any kind of analysis of what may have gone wrong. That can be even for forensic purposes, for example. It's difficult to tell why something failed, especially in the context of security. I'm only mentioning two. So the first one was Modbus and the second one is DNP3, just as examples. Clearly there are many more standards used, many more routing and communication protocols used in industrial control systems, but I'm using these two as examples because from the perspective of cybersecurity, they are sufficient to see the kinds of challenges, the kinds of security challenges that exist in this space. DNP3 is an open standard. It was developed in the early 90s, and the purpose was to provide interoperability between the different SCADA manufacturers' devices. That's because at the time, well, this is actually still the case to some extent, but less so. At the time, every SCADA manufacturer would have their own kind of proprietary protocols used. So DNP3 was used as to stop this and to have some kind of interoperability so that the different kinds of devices can talk to each other, even if they are bought from different manufacturers. So you wouldn't have to buy all your devices from one manufacturer. And if that manufacturer went out of business, you would not be completely out of luck. The DNP3 again is a master-slave protocol. The slave devices are now referred to as outstations. So this is terminology, doesn't make any real difference. Again, they are slaves, but we call them outstations in DNP3 terminology. And the usual configuration is, as shown there, is the multi-drop configuration. In the multi-drop configuration, all the outstations receive all the requests, but respond only to those addressed to them. So the master might be sending a kind of message, and then that message will go to all of them. will go to all of them, but only the one that is interested in it will receive it. Oh no, actually all of them will receive it. Only the one that is interested in it will respond to it. The messages in DNP3 are time-stamped, so that helps enormously in terms of finding out what happened if something goes wrong. And there are two modes of operation. There can be polling. In this case, polling is like as in Modbus, the master sends a request, and then the outstation responds to this request. So again, what is the temperature? What is the level of water? Please let me know. The outstation, when it receives this request from the master, then at that point it responds with a reply. Or it can be report by exception. So this is something that didn't exist in Modbus. In report by exception, the outstation can be set to report events without having to wait for a question by the master. So it doesn't need to wait for the master to ask. If there is a very low level of water, for example, or a very high temperature, then there might be a rule that specifies this. It might say, if the temperature is above this threshold, then this outstation should report that event to the master. So this is an unsolicited, in a sense, a message that is sent by the outstation, although the master has not asked for it explicitly, and it happens when something important happens. So if usually in some kind of if there is some kind of danger, some kind of safety concern. DNP3 has progressed significantly since the 90s when it was first designed. There is in fact, for cybersecurity specifically, there is the secure authentication improvement of DNP3. In the secure authentication, the master can include a critical code in the message. And so the critical code would be when the message corresponds to some request like outstation please shut down, or this outstation should be rebooted, or this oustation's key parameters or critical parameters need to be modified. So if something very important needs to happen, and so if something critical in a sense needs to happen, then the master includes critical code in the message. And then when the outstation receives this critical code, then it asks from the master to prove that it really is the master. So the outstation needs to make sure that before it does something that is of concern, if it is something critical, it needs to know for sure that it is the real master that sent its message. So it does this using cryptography. It is asking for the master to prove that it has the right secret key, as is the case in cryptography. So by proving that it has the right secret key, it proves that it is the real master, the authentic master. And it doesn't, in order, of course, for this not to be exchanged, for the key not to be exchanged in this case, the master is asked to do something with the key, some kind of cryptographic function, run this function with a message, and see what the result is. And if the result is the same as the result that the outstation expects, then it proves that the master has the right key. So the outstation never asks for the key. It simply asks the master to do something that you can do correctly only if you have the right key. So in this sense, the master is proving that it has the right key, so it is the authentic master. Now, well, of course, if that works well, then the outstation then does what it is requested to do. The session keys change regularly. So, for example, they might change every 15 minutes. And interestingly, also the master can request from outstations to prove that they are the real outstations, that they are authentic, that they are not rogue outstations in a sense. So what this means about the DNP3 secure authentication is that it guarantees authenticity and integrity of messages. So the messages are authentic and they have not been modified in an unauthorized way by some kind of attacker. What the DNP3 secure authentication doesn't do is that it doesn't specify encryption for the confidentiality of the actual information transmitted. So if, for example, the attacker sees that there are many unsolicited messages that are coming from, let's say, outstation number 2, then it knows that there is something important happening in outstation number 2, in the area that is covered by outstation number 2. So this is information about the perhaps physical hazard, about safety hazards, that safety concerns that exist at that moment in the area covered by outstation 2. So this is useful intelligence, this is useful information for someone aiming to affect the security of an industrial facility. Now, unlike Modbus, DNP3 can also work with more than one masters, by having one master perhaps and multiple submasters in a hierarchical kind of configuration. In this kind of configuration, the submasters might be some kind of high-level RTUs which receive the information from the outstations, they aggregate the data, and then they send the aggregated data to the master. This can make things much more efficient. It can reduce the load on the master if it receives only information in an aggregated form. However, it means that it is possible to exploit this kind of configuration by having, if there is any kind of rogue outstation, any kind of real RTU that has been modified, for example, it has been compromised, or any other kind of computer that pretends to be an RTU and has connected to the network, pretending to be part of the outstations. So this kind of rogue outstation could be configured to send continuously unsolicited responses. In this way, it would overwhelm the submaster that corresponds to this outstation, and then any other outstation trying to send unsolicited responses, reports by exception, during that period might not be able to do so. So this would be a standard denial of service attack, in this case a single source denial of service attack, where what is exploited is the fact that every system has a limit, and the submasters will also have limits. For example, in the number of unsolicited responses that they can keep before they send it to the masters. Now, up to now, we have talked about the different networking systems, the different networking protocols and standards used in industrial control systems, about Modbus and its weaknesses, about DNP3 and its attempts to improve cybersecurity by having the secure authentication. These are the technical parts are important, but perhaps more important are factors that affect more generally SCADA security, more generally industrial control system security. And this, for a start, is that such systems have very strict real-time requirements. By this we mean that they are safety critical systems. They tend to be safety critical systems. So the system that could monitor the water levels in a nuclear facility, for example, is a safety critical system. And this means that it should expect responsiveness from the SCADA system, and it should expect freshness from the SCADA system. By responsiveness, we mean that if the master says that it needs something to be done, then this needs to be done quickly. So if the master says if the master instructs an outstation to reboot, this needs to happen quickly. If the information is received from, received from a sensor, from the RTUs that collect data from sensors, if this kind of information is not fresh, then this can be a very important problem. So the information coming from sensors needs to come very quickly, so that it still is true, so it is still correct, so that the sensor values have not changed by the time the SCADA system has received them. In fact, slowed down SCADA systems have caused, not only can cause, but have caused disasters and have impeded response to disasters by delaying their detection. In fact, perhaps a more important factor is a continuous availability, which is a requirement with almost all industrial control systems. It is common to expect 5 nines. 5 nines means 99.999% availability. That is, that the system is available, is up for 99.99% of the time. And with such an expectation, field devices, any kind of system that is involved in an industrial control system, may run for long periods of time without rebooting. And as is the case with any kind of computing device that runs for very long periods of time without rebooting, well, it leads to accumulation of different types of problems. It leads to accumulation of fragmentation. It starts becoming more vulnerable to buffer overflows. In fact, between 2010 and 2014, in only 4 years, I would actually describe these 4 years as the years of most activity in the cybersecurity of this sector. ICS-CERT, the Industrial Control System Cyber Emergency Response Team, issued alerts for buffer overflow affecting software in 9 different high-profile SCADA vendors. Another important factor, less technical certainly, is in terms of the behavior, in terms of the perceptions of the people involved in SCADA systems, in industrial control systems, in the operation or of the designs of these systems. And there was certainly in the past, much less so, I must say, this misguided perception that there is such a thing as security by obscurity in industrial control systems. The reality is that there is no such thing. There is no such thing as an obscure system anymore, or if there is a system that is obscure, well, that doesn't mean anything, because we can find on the internet let's say the manufacturer's manual for pretty much any PLC or any RTU that has been made, any kind of software that has been made to control SCADA servers. So something being obscure, well, in fact, the more unknown something is, the more closed, the more proprietary something is, the more likely that it has not been subjected to public scrutiny, the more likely that it has some kind of flaws, some kind of vulnerabilities that no one has really checked yet. And in this sense, there is no really any kind of indication that having something that is unknown is by any means better in terms of security. It's a false sense of security more than anything. SCADA systems are very often based on COTS, on commercial off-the-shelf either hardware or software. There might be COTS computer servers, or it might be general purpose operating systems like Microsoft Windows. So any kind of malware that might be designed for general purpose computing systems might very well infect a SCADA server if it finds its way into one. So if a SCADA server somehow is connected to a network, to the internet, or perhaps someone that has been infected by malware connects to that SCADA server, some kind of employee, then that SCADA server running Microsoft Windows or running some kind of application that is general purpose, that is COTS, this commercial off the shelf, will very easily be infected by this kind of malware. Although the malware will not be targeted against this system, it will still affect it in the same way. And another problem is, another factor is interconnectivity. SCADA systems, industrial control systems, are by no means isolated anymore. It is perhaps they were in the past, first in the monolithic generation. They are certainly not now in the networked generation. They are certainly not now in the fourth generation of the Internet of Things. Even legacy SCADA systems are retrofitted nowadays with networking capabilities. Why? Because it is very convenient. It is very convenient to be able to connect remotely to a SCADA server. You don't anymore have to enter a room, show a badge, and go through physical security in order to check, for example, the sensor values recorded or monitored. You can do this now remotely with networking capabilities. But interconnectivity, of course, creates new vulnerabilities, because threats can go through networks. Malware can go through networks. Intruders can jump between networks, especially if firewalls are not present or if firewalls are not configured correctly. And it would not be an exaggeration to say that most firewalls, perhaps more firewalls, are configured incorrectly than the firewalls that are configured correctly in the world. There have been quite a few pieces of research showing that the most problems with firewalls are that they are not configured correctly by the human beings configuring them. And there are also further security challenges, because networks can be shared with external trusted partners, for example, with contractors for some periods of time, for sister utilities, if it's in the utility sector, with employees working remotely. So when you have all this interconnectivity, you can expect threats to jump between one section to another, to jump between one place to another. And the extreme of interconnectivity, of course, is internet accessibility. The web accessibility, the internet accessibility of HMI, of various databases, means that systems like SCADA systems or industrial control systems in general, they can be as vulnerable as any other system that has a web-based interface, that has a web-based element. It might not be the whole system that might be affected, but perhaps sensor values can be extracted from web-based databases, from web-based HMIs, if there is any kind of web-based vulnerability. And there are, of course, many web-based vulnerabilities. There are many threats in websites. There are many threats in the web, for example, cross-site scripting, SQL injection. All of these are attacks, types of attacks that have existed for very long periods of time, and they don't seem to be going away. And now let's try to see all this discussion about industrial control system security, about the different weaknesses in the various systems, the different misconceptions in security. Let's try to see all this in a case study in Stuxnet. Stuxnet was a spectacular piece of malware. Everything about it was unusual. In fact, its target was unusual. Its target was the centrifuges for uranium enrichment in Iran, and well, that in terms of the political situation back then, these centrifuges being targeted is not that unusual, because a major political issue at the time was Iran's nuclear program in the Middle East. But what is unusual is that it was a cyber target, not merely that it was a target, but it was a target of a cyber attack. So, for some background, a centrifuge is a system like this one, a machine like this one on the right, which uses rotation so as to separate the uranium-235 from the uranium-238. This is what really enriching means increasing the percentage of uranium-235 by separating it from U-238. In order to achieve this, it does rotation. It is this rotation that really matters in this case. It is this the physical aspect of having something rotating, a machine rotating, that was really exploited. Ralph Lankner is the industrial control system security expert. That was the person who, one of the key persons who analyzed Stuxnet. And in his opinion, the Iranian engineers at the time were using two workarounds, because they had relatively old designs of, actually pretty old devices, designs of centrifuges used. So these designs exhibited quite a few problems, and they had some workarounds for the problematic ones. So they had some shut-off valves that would isolate any problematic centrifuges, and if there were too many of these problematic centrifuges that had been shut off, then there were overpressure relief valves that would release the buildup of pressure. A centrifuge in practice can be, as was shown actually, can be damaged by either excessive pressure, so this is done if, for example, the valves do not work correctly, or by rotation speeds that would cause some kind of vibration. So that would have a physical effect. These kinds of rotation speeds that would not be the standard rotation speeds, of course, would cause vibrations. A first variant of Stuxnet that we are aware of, that targeted the first part. It targeted the excessive pressure. So what it tried to do is try to prevent shut-off valves and overpressure relief valves from working, from activating when they were needed. In this way, they were not working correctly as workarounds, and there were many. There would be many centrifuges affected by this. Now, in practice, we don't know how well this first variant of Stuxnet did. We only know that it targeted the PLCs, the programmable logic controllers, that were controlling these. An interesting part is that Stuxnet, that early variant of Stuxnet had malicious code that was sitting between the PLC and the devices, the valves and the sensors, and it was recording the measurements coming from the sensors when it was in normal operation, and then it would replay them later. So in this sense, when malware was working, when Stuxnet malware was working, and it would affect, for example, the shut-off valves, well, it would show that the sensors were reporting values that were normal. So it would not show to the human operator that something is abnormal. So in that way, it would prevent them from noticing that there is something wrong with the shut-off valves and there is something wrong with the centrifuges. But again, this is kind of theory in a sense, because Stuxnet, this is the early variant of Stuxnet. We don't know anything about how well it fared. Now, the Stuxnet that we know about is it targeted the different PLCs. It targeted the S7315 Siemens PLCs that were controlling the rotors drives, so the rotors of the centrifuges, so effectively the speed of rotation. What it was doing is that it would temporarily run the centrifuges at speeds very different to the standard ones. So it would be either too low at 120 rotations per minute for 50 minutes, or too high, so 84,600 rotations per minute for 15 minutes. Or it would go through speeds in a way that would cause resonant vibrations. So these vibrations would gradually create damage, physical damage to the centrifuges. In fact, the attacks were separated by weeks between them, so that it would be very difficult for Stuxnet to be noticed. So it was a very long period of time that it is believed that Stuxnet was in operation. The actual attack path is that it used more likely more likely infected some engineer's laptop, perhaps via USB stick. Now, note that it is highly unlikely that Stuxnet in any way affected over the internet that nuclear facility. The nuclear facilities do not tend to have such a lax security that a piece of malware from the internet will end up in the centrifuges. Instead, it is possible that the connection, so it was probably in a sense isolated, this network, but in a sense the isolation was nullified by having a human being, an engineer, infecting it with their infected laptop. So, without knowing, of course. So, the laptop, this is an assumption, the laptop connected to the network, it infected the network, and Stuxnet then spread. It attempted to download its latest version. It would keep doing that. The latest versions of itself. That's very interesting, in fact, for this kind of malware. And in fact, the control files, the software used to configure the PLCs. Then, like the earlier variant of Stuxnet, it would record the normal operation sensor data. It would modify the rotational speed, so it would affect the rotors. It would request a change in the speeds of the centrifuges, and at the same time it would be feeding back to the HMI, to the human operators, the old sensor data. So the users, the human operators, will not be able to see that something is wrong, that they are going too fast or too slow, or crossing the resonance, some kind of speed that is damaging the centrifuge. And the result is that if I remember correctly, it was around 1,000 centrifuges. That is the expectation that were damaged in this way. Of course, we're talking about a facility that would be using thousands, so 1,000 is not necessarily a massive impact. It's certainly an important impact, but not necessarily a crippling impact. The Stuxnet, interestingly, used stolen digital certificates from trusted organizations, from legitimate organizations. So someone had stolen these certificates, and it was these certificates that were used in order to bypass any kind of antivirus or anything else that would be looking for malware. So by carrying these digital certificates, these trusted stolen digital certificates from trusted organizations, Stuxnet was able to bypass quite a few of the security measures. And highly unusually, in fact it was probably the first time in history, Stuxnet used 4 different zero-day vulnerabilities. Now, to put things into context, back then, in a year, you wouldn't see more than 10 or 12, perhaps, vulnerabilities reported to Symantec or any of these companies that analyze malware. So, having 4 zero-day vulnerabilities in the same malware does indeed show the importance of this malware and how powerful and how capable the team behind it was. So the impact of Stuxnet is that it infected many of the centrifuges. It is believed it has damaged around 1,000 of them. Interestingly, it was designed to affect only the very specific system configuration in Natan. So even if it affected other kinds of PLCs, it would not have the same impact. It had this impact because it was configured specifically for Natanz, so the designers of this malware knew exactly the kind of configuration there, and they knew exactly how they would affect it, how they would rotate it, how they would affect its health by rotating at different speeds. And in fact, it also had a built-in expiration date, so that it was June 24th of 2012, so it wouldn't work after this date. The enrichment data that we have from that period shows that there was no noticeable reduction of the available centrifuges. So although many were damaged, it is believed that the Iranians were making new ones at such rate that there was not a significant decrease in the enrichment capacity. In fact, it was probably increased back then. And more generally, Stuxnet had perhaps limited effect in this sense, but it had profound effect in terms of the impact in strategic thinking. It was a paradigm shift. It has been described as game changer in military thinking, in security in general, certainly in cyber-physical security and in cyber security. Things are really not quite the same since Stuxnet in these spaces. But it was also a blueprint for future attacks, whether it is from similar teams or completely different criminals, from criminals actually. It is completely unknown, but it's certain that malware using stolen certificates have increased dramatically since then. There are many more types of malware that would use this technique of the stolen certificates to evade security measures. Also, from the perspective of science and research, open research has increased massively, has increased dramatically, especially in cyber-physical security and in the security of industrial control systems. Generally, people are much more aware. We see much less of this security by obscurity kind of mentalities. We see much less of the mentality of something being isolated, meaning that it's secure. Well, the network there was isolated in a sense. It was not connected to the internet or anything, but simply the fact that someone could physically connect to it and that person might have been deceived into being infected with malware means that isolation doesn't mean that much nowadays. Actually, it does mean a lot, but it doesn't mean that much when a target is so critical, so the attacker would do anything possible in order to infect it. And in a sense, Stuxnet brought to the forefront the digital arms trade of zero-day vulnerabilities, because if zero-day vulnerabilities can be used in this way, and if it is possible to use 4 of them, or if it makes sense to use 4 of them, then there is a digital arms trade now. So there is a lot of money that is normally legally, I would say, that is traded, that exchanges hands in this digital arms trade. And it also kickstarted a discussion, perhaps not kickstarted it, but accelerated the discussion on ethics in cyber warfare, in cyber physical warfare, in the use of cyber in general as part of political or more clearly in this case even military operation.